Cardio. G'day on. Taking a look at the Australian education system. Now, we have only seen little tidbits about this, but I've never actually, I don't think, taken the time to kind of learn about it as a whole, and maybe some similarities, of course, probably some differences, at least compared to what I went through and in general, the U.S. educational system. Now, I'm sure this varies quite a bit depending on where you're at in Australia, different states, territories, maybe rural versus cities. So take this with a grain of salt. And of course, that applies to the U.S. as well. Your education system in Chicago area in Illinois might differ from literally Southern Illinois. And of course, will differ from, Florida all the way to California. And we'll be featuring some clips from Living Simply Australia. So make sure to check the description, as she will be linked down below. Make sure to check her out. And of course, we'll be looking at a little bit of our own research as well. It is the weekend. I hope you're having a good one. And yeah, let's get into it.
If you're a working parent of very young kids, it's likely that you'll have to send your kids to childcare or kindergarten. Childcare refers to private or community-based centers where people usually take their kids to be looked after. And this is usually for kids aged over 6 weeks. And these childcare centers, you're going to find them around your suburb, in your area. Something
over 6 weeks.
that you should know is that the cost of childcare can range from 70 Australian dollars to 185 Australian dollars per day. Now, another option to community-based or private childcare centers is to access this type of services, but in your own home. So, for example, you can hire a nanny or a specific certified professional to come to your home and look after your kids. These type of services are called family daycare and in-home care. And the cost of these services can range from 15 Australian dollars per hour or 35 Australian dollars per hour. And
Sadly, I can't. So she's talking about really early, almost before school, right? When we're talking about home care type of stuff, and or what we would call daycare, right? And that would be before typical traditional schooling. Sadly, I actually, very luckily didn't have to do this. So I don't know what the prices would be around me compared to these Australian prices.
in some instances, maybe a bit more. Now, in some cases, if you meet specific requirements, you may be able to access subsidies, that is government funding, to cover the cost of childcare services. And this type of financial support is called childcare subsidy. If your children are not that young and they are between 3 years old and 5 years old, you can send them to kindergarten.
That makes sense.
Programs. Kindergarten.
Typically here in, at least in my area, preschool, you could start at, I believe, 3, although it's pretty rare. Typically, they would be, maybe 4 in their first year of preschool. And then should you finish that out, then, of course, you would start actual kindergarten, which is the more traditional, real start of school. Kindergarten would be, I believe they have to be 5 years old here in the U.S. At least this is how it's been for us with our kids.
Refers to a 2-year preschool program for children aged between 3 years old and 5 years old.
Wow.
And these preschool programs are usually
like here.
before the kids start primary school. Disclaimer: kindergarten and preschool programs may be called differently depending on where you live, which Australian state you live in, right? And this is a bit tricky because in New South Wales and the ACT, for example, they call kindergarten first year of primary school. The
Which makes
activities
sense.
that precede primary school are called preschool programs. Whereas in other states, like here in Victoria, those preschool activities before year 1, it's called kindergarten. I know that this is a bit confusing, but hopefully it kind of makes sense. Now, the usual weekly hours that children spend in kindergarten or preschool programs is around 15 hours per week. And they usually go to either a morning or an afternoon session.
Okay, so that applies to preschool only here. Preschool, you kind of sign up, whatever's available, and you would typically pick an afternoon session, so maybe like noon to 3 or something like that. Or of course morning, which would be 8 to 11:30, something like that, right? That's how it is for preschool here, as far as I know, in our experience. Now, once you get to kindergarten, though, it's all day, like your typical older grades, right? So, usually around 8 in the morning, 8:05, something like this, all the way till 2:30 or 3 p.m. That's my experience, even as early as kindergarten.
How much do you pay for these services will vary according to the kindergarten itself, because these are private institutions and they set their fees themselves. If you're not able to afford kindergarten services or preschool services, you may be able to access financial support provided by the government in the form of subsidies to be able to manage these costs. And the best way to find a kindergarten is to contact your local council. Now let's talk about school education, primary and secondary school here in Australia. Attending primary and secondary school here in Australia is compulsory for kids aged between 6 years old and 16 years old. And that means that school is compulsory between year 1 and year 9 or 10. And let me briefly explain how it works. Primary school in Australia.
Okay, let's hear how it works. 6 to 16 sounds a little bizarre, just because I think regular school that you would be expected to do here is 6 to 18 or 17. Some kids graduate when they're 17 if they have a late birthday. For me, I had an early birthday for my grade, so I was, of course, 18 when I graduated high school, just because I was one of the oldest in the grade.
Australia runs for 7 to 8 years and starts from year 1 or prep or kindergarten in some states and finishes in year 6 or year 7.
Wow. First year primary school in Australia, foundation year, is called differently across states. Kindergarten, you can see the states here, prep, preparatory. Wow, they're literally called something else in almost every state. Wow, okay, interesting.
Secondary school in Australia runs for 3 to 4 years. And depending on where you live, again, it may go from year 7 to year 10 or year 8 to year 10. Now, after secondary school, there's something called senior secondary school. And this runs for 2 years, year 11 and year 12.
Wow.
And of course, year 12 is the last year of secondary school. Another thing that perhaps...
Let me know in the comments, because I'll be interested to know, I'll probably get viewers from different countries, but mostly Australia here. And of course, you're going to be from different states and territories. If you want to chime in on what you think your area is like for this. So you have primary, secondary. That's already different from how we categorize it here. Here you usually have elementary school, which is grades 1 or kindergarten, I guess. But let's say grades 1 through 6. Then you have middle school, which is 7 and 8, grades 7 and 8. Then you have high school, which is grades 9 through 12. And then, of course, maybe you've even heard through movies or something like, grade 9 is freshman year, grade 10 is sophomore year, and then grade 11 is junior year, grade 12 is senior year. And those are all your high school years. I'm a little shocked to hear you guys don't have high school. Now, don't attack me. I know everywhere is different, and not everywhere is just like America. I'm not one of those Americans. But I'm just so used to those being high school. And I figured maybe in other English-speaking countries that was the thing as well, but apparently not. So this is why I'm learning about this. I think that's pretty interesting. So you have primary school, secondary school, and then, did she say senior secondary school?
What you might want to know is that the school year in Australia usually starts in late January, early February, and it runs all year until mid-December.
Wow.
And kids get an average of 10 to 12 weeks or even 14 weeks in some instances of school holidays per.
Okay, this is big. This sounds funny to me, but in reality, this makes more sense. You start your school year in January. Of course, that makes perfect sense. That's literally the beginning of the calendar. And it goes till mid-December. How freaking cool. Now, it sounds like a lot. 10 to 14 weeks of, weeks off of school sounds like a good amount. I just wonder when that happens, because I want to say, trying to think, here in the U.S., you go typically like August something, or maybe very early September is the beginning of the school year, and then you go all the way till the following year till usually May, and that's your school year. So August to May, and June, July, you usually typically have off for summer break. There's also some schools that go year round here. I've never been to one of those, but some schools offer that here where it's year round, but they have like 4 breaks. I would say that's more on the rare side here, though. But yeah, you get your summer break here typically, and somehow it flies by. But, that's basically 2 months and a little bit of, 1 or 2 weeks bonus. And that's how it goes here. In reality, it's kind of weird if you think about it. But yeah.
Year. But again, these numbers will
big
vary
difference
according to where you live. Okay, let's talk about costs. Yay! How much do schools cost in Australia? Is Australian education free? The answer is yes and no. This is why. Primary and secondary education in Australia is free if your kids go to public or state government schools.
Right.
Because this type of institution.
And believe it or not, even though for some reason we don't have universal healthcare here, weird, we have universal school here, and that's not what it's called, but you get the idea. We pay taxes, and therefore you can go to public schools in your district here for essentially free. Even though you do pay for taxes. And Yeah, I'm assuming that's how it works in a lot of places.
Having said that, you do need to take into account that you may have to pay for a small annual fee, which is usually around 400 Australian dollars per year.
And you'll
have to pay for your kids' school uniforms, textbooks, and stationery and other activities. But having said that, overall, public schools in Australia are free. Okay, another very important thing to know about public schools in Australia is that enrollment in these schools is based on location. And this means that it's likely that your kids will have to go to the school that's located in their local area. Another type of school education here in Australia is Catholic schools. Catholic schools are run by the Roman Catholic Church, and as such,
we have different religious denomination schools, so you can go find, Catherine schools. I said Catherine schools. Wow, Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, Baptist schools, whatever. Right, the list goes on. And then all those usually fall under the private school umbrella. Now, some private schools may not be super religious either. Some are just, more important on higher education. But yeah, you can obviously go to public school here and you could go to private school here. Now, of course, private schools, regardless of religion or whatever, you're going to have to pay for those, right? So they're not publicly funded. You're going to have to pay a tuition for those. But typically the deal is, it's going to be a little more formal. It's going to be uniforms here for private school, and they're going to promise a better education.
The values that underpin Catholic schools are driven by Christian principles. Now, the good thing about these type of schools is that they're not as expensive as private schools. Why? Because they're probably subsidized by the government. So
now that's cool, and that's different because Catholic schools here aren't like that. Their Catholic school would also be a private school, and you would have to pay quite a bit for tuition, thousands of dollars a year. And they're not subsidized. That's pretty interesting.
You usually have to pay a relatively small fee.
Wow.
Now, independent of private school, you can expect to pay for private schooling around $20,000 per year. And again,
now that's a lot. Although it just depends. It varies quite a bit. I'm sure you could find schools that expensive here in the U.S. But typically for, we're not talking about universities or college. We're talking about grades, whatever, kid age schooled. Typically, private schools here would be more like, $5,000 to $12,000 US dollars per year. But then again, if you do the Australian dollars to US dollars conversion, maybe that's about the same. Actually, now that I think about it.
Remember that these numbers will vary depending on the state or area you live in as well.
Yeah.
There are other types of private schools here in Australia, such as faith-based schools, selective schools, or science schools, for example. So if you're interested in a particular teaching method,
what are those?
I highly recommend doing a bit of research on this because there's a whole range of different school systems to choose from as well. Now, if you're interested in learning a bit more about the higher education system in Australia, and this involves universities and vocational education and training, I highly recommend watching these videos here and here, or if you're interested.
I will probably have to watch those in my own time. That sounds pretty cool. Okay, we're going to go to a couple more things. We're going to research a couple more things, but this is interesting so far. A lot of differences already I'm seeing. Big differences being, the way, and this is not a big deal, but this is kind of expected. The titles, right? Like what they, primary school, secondary school, right? That type of thing is not used here. An obvious difference in the wording and how things are categorized. A similarity seems to be similar in you go to whatever schools in your local zone or region, district. I don't remember the exact terminology, but that sounds about right. Some of that can be actually kind of funny or funky, at least in my immediate area. I could have a family member describe that another time. They know a lot more than me, but there are some weird zones where you could even have certain streets with houses on the same street, but they go to different school districts. So that's just like weird district lines or zoning here in the U.S. That's like a weird thing. This is also why you see a lot of people, try and kind of bite the bullet and pay for private school in the U.S. because they might be in a weird district that doesn't really make sense for their house. And, maybe the school, a lot of public schools are good here, and then a lot of public schools aren't so good. And some parents aren't, too happy about that. So, all right, for this next segment, we're going to move on to kind of an AI breakdown. So take this with a grain of salt, although, hopefully it's mostly, semi-relevant information. So, of course, we have Australia versus United States school system differences. And I don't know, it shows random pictures. I'm not sure what those are quite about, but School year calendar, right? So yeah, this kind of confirms school year runs January to December in Australia. It has 4 terms with breaks in April, July, and September, October. So you'll have to tell me if that's accurate. That's kind of interesting. Although it does say a big summer break, kind of like you would expect here in December through January. But that doesn't sound like 2 or 3 months, right? I mean, mid-December to basically the end of January. It's a pretty big break, but it's not quite as big as like June through mid-August. As you can see, ours is usually 2 semesters or 3 trimesters. Long summer break from June to August. It's funny. American kids have summer vacation during June and August, while Aussie kids have summer during Christmas. I think that's super cool and a revolving theme on this channel for sure. Uniforms. Almost all schools, public or private, require uniforms in Australia. I thought I've heard that long ago, so that's cool to see that. I think that's cool. I grew up with uniforms in the schools I went to, so I can relate to this. I thought it was fun, and I think it's kind of cool. It puts everyone on the same page, the same, general outfit. So you don't have, people cliques with different, outfits and brands and all that stuff. I think it's a net positive, if you ask me. It exists here in the U.S., but it's not super common, at least when it comes to public schools. I find this interesting how it says blazers, ties, hats. Sun protection is a big deal. Skirts and tailored shorts. Sun protection is not even thought of for any schooling or school uniforms here in the U.S. As it says, most public schools do not require uniforms in the U.S. Only some charter, magnet, and private schools have them. And it continues with the sun stuff. Kids often wear mandatory sun hats outside. No hat, no play rule. Is that true? That is actually, it makes sense. That is really cool for Australia. It sounds so Australian, actually. I mean, you guys have that strong Aussie sun, right? Strong UV equals sunscreen rules, shaded playgrounds. That's super cool. Wait, do you guys have playgrounds with like the big shades over them? If you do, I'm kind of jealous. That is actually hella cool. Wow, that is like unheard of here in the U.S. No universal hat rule in the United States. Nope. Sunscreen rules vary. Some schools don't allow kids to apply their own. Wow, that's kind of messed up, if that's true. It could be. I will say that I never once applied sunscreen to my skin in school. So that's my anecdote. Yeah, kind of crazy if you think about it, because we still have the sun here too. Then we have the grading style. Australia focuses on an A to E system. That is totally different. Okay. Moderated assessments, internal assessments often weighted heavily for year 11 and 12. Less emphasis on constant standardized testing. United States, A to F scale, right? That's what we have. A being a good grade, F being you failed, right? We have a GPA scale, 4.0 being the highest. And then, of course, more standardized tests. We have PSATs, SATs, ACTs. Yeah. Homework loads can be heavier in many districts. Our homework load even when I was at school, and we're talking 20 years ago, I heard homework loads are still pretty crazy, sometimes worse than when I was a kid. But even when I was a kid, homework was pretty wicked. Like they sent home a lot of homework and it sucked. It's cool to hear in other countries, I've heard kind of consistently that there's a less emphasis on like loads of homework. I think that's really nice. Yeah, here it was pretty rough. GPA culture barely exists in Australia. Interesting. Okay, then we have the school structure. We kind of explained that earlier. This lines up with what I said as well. And then school start times. These aren't too bad. Maybe a little earlier lunch in Australia. School sports. I'm willing to bet, yeah, we can see here that school sports are probably more intense here. School sports are like almost a religion here. They are like insanely intense, big. Some schools are like defined by their sports. It's a really big deal here. And it seems like almost consistently when I learned about other countries, school sports are not nearly as big of a deal as they are here in the U.S. I think we kind of stand on our own with the obsession with school sports. Food and canteen differences. Australia, school canteens sell meat pies, sausage rolls, Vegemite sandwiches, chicken and chips, fresh fruit tubs. That's really cool. United States, pizza slices, burgers, tater tots, milk cartons with every meal, PB&J. Yeah, and some even worse foods. This is unfortunately very accurate. Teacher and student culture. Teachers are referred to as Miss, Sir, or last name. Teachers are seen as more casual, friendly, more outdoor lesson culture. That is cool. They need to do that here. Teachers are always Mr., Mrs. plus last name. Yep, that's always how it works here. More formal boundaries, less outdoor class culture. Yeah, accurate. Australia doesn't seem to have as many lockers. School are often spread out and outdoors. I like that. Hallways lined with lockers, classic American vibe. Indoor school buildings are standard. Yeah, I wish we had more outdoor schools here. It's pretty rare unless you live somewhere with really good weather. Now, this is interesting how Australia seems to have a national curriculum. You'll have to tell me if that's accurate. More consistency in what kids learn. Honestly, on the surface, that makes a lot more sense. Here, that is not the case. That's why your education system can just wildly vary here in the U.S. Some people have really good education, and some people you've seen online. Some of the United States education systems are hilariously bad, and it's because they're not consistent. Every state has different standards, and of course, within those states, there's good schools and just terrible schools. It literally depends on your zip code, which is literally your immediate area. And finally, we have exams. You guys have the HSC, the VCE, and the ATAR. We have the SAT, ACT for college. Some schools drop them. AP classes, yep, those are like right before in your last grade 11 and 12. Those are like to prep you for university. And then, of course, heavy use of standardized testing. So it seems like we have a little more emphasis on some big time tests and homework, which kind of sucks, right? Now, of course, once you go to university, I haven't learned about that too much, but I think Australian universities still cost less as well. Here, I'm sure you've maybe heard online that a lot of people go into heavy student debt here in the U.S., and that's a big problem. And I don't know, our education system, unfortunately, like a lot of things nowadays, is a hit or miss. It could really be good for some people, but for a lot of people, it doesn't work out well, and some of it is just a mess. So I think this is pretty interesting. Now, some similarities, quite a few differences, if I'm being honest, a little more than I would have thought. And I think this will be a good one for comments. Maybe we'll get some clarity on some things. Yeah, one of the things I take away from this is the Australian education system, like everything, I'm sure it's really solid. It's also a little more, chillaxed. I like that. And it makes a little more sense when it comes to the calendar. I will totally give you that. Also like how uniforms are more standards and stuff. Some people might not like that. I think it's actually kind of cool. Anyway, I'm going to end it there. I hope you're having an awesome weekend, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. My name is Ian. You're watching IWrocker. Until next time, y'all. Catch you later.